In today's Farm Report, with spring planting upon us, many producers may be entering into contracts with landowners to rent out either cropland or pasture land. And while many of those may be oral agreements, as the USDA's Rod Bain reports, a written agreement may be better.
Some people long for the days when a man's word and a handshake was a binding agreement. Now, handshake agreements, especially when it comes to property such as lease agreements, are still utilized, mostly among relatives and close friends. But as Rusty Rumley of the University of Arkansas's National Agricultural Law Center points out,
those are perfectly valid and enforceable, but if they're going to have an oral lease, the lease cannot be for longer than 1 year at a time.
And there may be other issues that come up as well.
Maybe they don't exactly remember what all the things they agreed to over the years were. So not having something in writing can cause a lot of problems if there's a dispute later on.
And what if the landlord passes away and the contract falls to the person's heirs? They may interpret the agreement differently. This can apply to any number of situations.
Other things that come up is things like maintenance of the fences or barns, or can the tenant use the barn? If there's nothing in a written lease saying who's got to use it or who has to maintain it, then the general rule is the tenants get to use whatever's on the land that they're renting. So maybe a landlord doesn't want a tenant using a particular barn or something like that, or other type of facility. That needs to be in a written lease spelling that out. Otherwise, it's very difficult to prove.
Rumley says all these factors demonstrate why it's important to have leases, any agreement really, in writing.
Having things in writing is one way to ensure that you can put the agreement down and that a neutral party, whether it's an arbitrator, mediator, or a judge later on, can look at it and read exactly what the parties intended.
Now, verbal agreements can be recorded. Rumley says that is helpful, but
one nice thing about having the written contracts is many times we'll also include a clause in there in the written agreement that says, and all changes to this lease agreed to by the parties will be in here in writing.
He notes one or more parties could argue that they verbally agreed to modify part of the lease agreement, but did not have a method to record it in audio or video form.
The other thing is, when you're dealing with these oral leases, if it's still going to be for longer than 1 year, it has to be in writing. So a recording wouldn't be good enough. That's just because of that old statute of frauds that requires an actual physical writing.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
One of USDA's latest multi-million-dollar allocation funding is made available through the Value-Added Producer Grants Program.
We announced $30 million available for food entrepreneurs and agricultural producers to develop new products.
Lillian Salerno is the Rural Business Cooperative Service Administrator.
Farmers and ranchers are those creative people who live out in rural America, and with just a little bit of help from us can put that creativity to work and make sure that they can add value to the rural communities by improving the bottom line of their operations.
This support is especially important for beginning farmers, military veterans engaging in farming, and smaller farm operations participating in local and regional food systems.
These value-added producer grants help them develop new product lines to grow their businesses and expand their contributions.
Value-added producer grants, or VAPGs, can be used to develop new product lines from raw agricultural products or additional uses for already developed product lines. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.
When it comes to putting up a structure, we look to keep it nice and sturdy with the materials we use to build. But, as the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain reports, the most important piece may be the soil you build it on.
We think about soils doing so much for us, but perhaps there is one thing we overlook. In the building you are standing in right now, whether it's a house, an apartment, an office complex, a warehouse, or shed, look down. It is the soil that supports that structure you are in.
There's a lot of ways in which soil properties, characteristics of a soil, will influence how well it'll support a building. The soil, it can really determine where we can build and how we need to build in order to overcome any limitations that the soil might be presenting us.
Bob Dobos is with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service in Nebraska. He gives what he calls a classic example of soil supporting structures, the Houston black soil in Texas, that has a wide range of shrink-swell properties.
When the soil is dry, it shrinks and opens up pretty big cracks. And then when it re-wets, the soil swells and can exert a lot of pressure on a structure like a basement and will cave it in eventually.
So most houses constructed in that area are built on a slab specifically engineered to handle the shrink swell of Houston Black. Dobos says when soil is not allowed to move the water well due to the water table, then flooding could occur in a basement.
Your basement intersects the water table that might be present in the soil in the winter or the spring. And so then you need sump pump. Sump pump tries to lower the water table so that we don't get a lot of mold growth. And that's a real problem. A wet basement with all the dampness and mold growth can be a human health hazard.
Also,
the way the soil can help us to determine where to build is avoiding building a house on a floodplain or a place that might be inundated by moving water.
and there are areas where soil is just unstable.
There's situations in the Northeast called Leda clays, which the soil is a gel. When there's a shock, like an earthquake or something like that, the soil can liquefy, and then there can be an immediate subsidence of the structure and just destroy it that way.
Now, if you're building a new structure, Dobos advises looking at web soil surveys or talking with residents in an area, or even visiting your local NRCS Service Center soil scientist before construction begins.
The most important thing to consider is to just remember to consider the soil. If you're going to look at soils, then you should talk to a soil scientist. And I think that's the main thing, is we don't want to self-prescribe perhaps bad engineering because we haven't considered the soil resource when we're doing something.
By the way, to find USDA's Web Soil Survey, type in this address on your internet browser: Web Soil Survey, all one word, .nrcs.usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. No change in a record world soybean crop from year to year, according to USDA's first world production estimate for 2015-16.
In 14-15, we had a record world soybean crop. We have essentially that same number for 2015-16.
And Seth Meyer of the World Agricultural Outlook Board says that high production means a projected record world supply of soybeans to grow throughout the new marketing year. And with much of that coming from South America, that will have an impact on how the U.S. markets its soybean crop this year, reflected in lower year-to-year export estimates.
Now, when you look down at that, you'll say exports were trimmed 25 million bushels year over year. That's where that South American stock number comes into play. Large South American stocks are going to make it difficult for us to compete in the early part of that marketing year.
And soybean producers may see lower prices this marketing year, with USDA forecasting the midpoint price at $9 a bushel, down over $1 from the 2014-15 price estimate. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Farmers markets are the most traditional way to buy and sell produce and connect with farms, but as the USDA's Gary Crawford reports, it's also now trendy.
This is an important day to celebrate.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack celebrating the opening the other day of the farmers market here in a parking lot outside the Ag Department headquarters in Washington, a market that started here 20 years ago. At that time, Gus Schumacher was a top official here at USDA.
Yes, in 1995, Secretary Glickman said we need to have a farmers market here, and it was where I parked my car. So they said, well, that's where it's going to be. We're going to move the cars on Friday and have a farmers market here, and everybody went along with it, and it's just grown and grown and grown.
And today, 20 years later, we have twice as many vendors here as before.
So this thing has really exploded.
And the farmers market phenomenon is exploding across the country. Back in 1995, there were about 2,000 registered farmers markets in this country, but Ann Alonzo, who runs the USDA's marketing service, told us that number has skyrocketed.
Presently, we have about 8,268 farmers markets in our farmers market directory.
And the number is growing. Paul Muck is a farmer in West Virginia. He's selling here at the Ag Department market. He's been involved in farming practically all his life and in farmers markets for about 10 years, and he told us
30 years ago there were only a few farmers markets in highly populated areas because those are the only ones that seem to be able to do well. And now people are willing to travel to a farmer's market to enjoy everything that's available.
And the first thing that is available?
A fresher product, a more tasty product.
People are definitely more into the eat local, eat healthy movement, and it's good because that's what we do.
That's Kathy DeBernard, a farmer from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Big sellers for her now, of course, tomatoes, fruits, berries, things that can be eaten with little or no preparation.
But I also find that more things like squash, green beans, and greens Vegetables that need to be cooked don't sell as well because people are busy and don't have the time or the knowledge of how to prepare it quickly.
But Tracy sees that as part of her job, to let people know how to prepare and cook the items that she sells. In other words, her word for it is
Vegucate.
So a farmer's market offers vegucation, as she calls it. The ag department's Ann Alonzo says also, obviously,
it helps us connect with farmers, and we can ask questions, and we can really understand a lot more about the food that we're eating.
Also, in many farmers markets, there are prepared foods, places to eat them, and many of the markets also have live music, which is better than dead music. So a farmer's market can have a lot of things for consumers. But Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack says
it's an opportunity for small and mid-sized producers to have a market that they can control. It's also a great opportunity to encourage new and beginning farmers.
And he said USDA has several programs to help those farmers and to help start new farmers markets or improve existing ones. And with that, he cut the tape for the market here. In Washington, Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Residents in Fillmore County are invited to a public meeting on Wednesday, June 3rd, regarding the discovery of the emerald ash borer in the county. On April 24th, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture confirmed an infestation in the county. For more information, contact the Minnesota Department of Agriculture at mda.state.mn.us.